just welcome you to our second episode of Teaching Unpacked, Stories from the Classroom. Today we have a fabulous guest, Natalie Staats, and we're going to introduce her in a moment. But before we start, I just want to first off offer thanks to Peter and Molly Epic, who have been very generous in their support of this project and have really been the underwriters and the inspiration for everything that is going to be happening during this series. This is a 7 webcast series, and this is episode 2. So we will send out a link at the end of this to everyone who's registered so that you can get information about the remaining webcasts. So the way this will go is that Tom and I will introduce ourselves, and then we'll introduce Natalie. And then Natalie is going to tell us a little story, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. And that's sort of how our agenda today will go. So, Tom, you want to introduce yourself first?
Hello, everyone. Tom Julius here. It's so good to have you with us. My background is as an early childhood educator. I taught kindergarten, 2nd, and 3rd grade over the course of 17 years before joining the faculty at Antioch University, New England, where I've been for the last 23 years, which means I'm old.
So I'm Laura Thomas. I have not been at Antioch for 23 years. I've been there for 19 years, which makes me slightly less old, but still old. I taught high school theater, speech, debate, and English for about 10 years before I came to Antioch, and I'm both an alum and a faculty member. Before Tom introduces Natalie, there are a couple of other people I forgot to thank. Harold Hale, who is the man behind the curtain on these webinars. He takes care of all of the technical stuff related to these webinars. We couldn't do them without him. I also want to thank Peg Smeltz and Shelley Biles in our Division of Continuing Education. They take care of all the registration, make sure all the links work, and take care of following up with everyone after the fact to make sure that they have what they need. A couple of housekeeping details. There are 2 things that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. One is a chat and one is the Q&A. We really try to reserve the chat for technical issues or informal chit-chat stuff. If you have questions, please use the Q&A. That enables me to keep track of what questions we answered, and if there are any that we're not able to get to, we can pass those along to Natalie and she can follow up with them individually. Also, so you're aware, this webinar is being recorded. The link will be on the resources document that you'll be emailed after we're done today. Since everyone had to register, we have an email address for you. We'll reach out once with details about the resources, the link to the YouTube video, and the link to the evaluation. If you need a certificate of participation for this event for PD credits, you'll be able to access that certificate at the end of the evaluation. You'll be able to download that there. Also, our contact information is on that resources page, so if you have any questions or need any more information, you'll be able to get it there. So,
and Laura, have you actually clicked the record button? Is that something you still need to do? Okay, good.
Nope, we're recording.
Good.
So Tom, I'll let you go ahead and introduce Natalie, and we'll get started with the meat of our conversation.
Well, as you can see on this slide, Natalie is currently the director of high school and humanities, theology, and Latin teacher at Windham Christian Academy in Windham, Maine. Natalie, welcome. It is so good to have you with us here today. What you wouldn't know from this description is that Natalie is also training in training to be a Maine wilderness guide, to have her Maine wilderness guide license. Anybody brave enough to battle the black flies and mosquitoes in Maine qualifies in my mind to battle with high school students as well. Being an early childhood educator by background myself. But really why we have Natalie here today is because the humanities, theology, Latin, these are things that are often identified as very intellectual pursuits. But Natalie takes an especially experiential approach to the subject areas she teaches. And so Natalie, we're really looking forward to hearing about a specific experiential challenge that you've done with your class. So welcome.
All right, great, thank you. I'm excited to share. So I do want to talk a little bit first about my school so you can really understand the challenge that and the experience that we had. So my school is a very small pre-K through 12 school. So in my high school, this picture here, the kids' faces are blurred out for privacy, but this is my entire high school for this year. 9 through 12. So I have 10 students, and because of our small size, we end up having to have multi-age classrooms. In fact, all of our elementary and middle school is multi-age classrooms. Our middle school is self-contained 7th and 8th grade, which is a kind of a unique thing in this day and age where a lot of your middle schools are 5th through 8th and they're departmentalized. So our 7th and 8th is self-contained, and these kids who have come up through our school end up, they're with this same small group of kids for several years, and they get to know each other really well, and we've really become like a family. So with my high school kids and the challenge that I'm going to talk about today, I did with an 11th and 12th grade class. So my 9th and 10th graders are combined for their English, their history, their science, and their theology classes, and then 11th and 12th is combined for those same subjects. So I had this 11th and 12th grade American Studies class. We were doing the literature and the history in conjunction with each other. I was teaching both of those subjects. So we kind of have to do this alternating curriculum thing at the high school, where one year they'll, like for 11th and 12th, one year they'll have American history and American literature. The next year they'll have government economics and British lit or some form of that world literature type approach. So I teach all of that. And I was trying to figure out a way to really bring that alive to these kids. I get to kind of decide what I'm teaching and how I'm teaching it each year. So being a department of one, with occasionally my principal sometimes ends up teaching a class to help out, and she and I are able to work together really well. But I really get to tailor what I'm doing to my particular kids. So I had this American history class, American literature class. I decided to approach it thematically, and we were using the historical context of the particular works of literature that we were reading to study the history, and that's the foundation for the literature. So we read To Kill a Mockingbird, and we talked about the segregation. We read Arthur Miller's The Crucible, and we looked at McCarthyism, and we looked at why Arthur Miller used the setting of 1600s Puritan New England Salem witch trials to bring across his message about McCarthyism and the Cold War. And then we're also going to be reading Farewell to Manzanar, which is a memoir of the Japanese internment during World War II. And we were studying the lead up to World War II, and the internment and the circumstances surrounding that. And I needed a way to connect all of these for the kids and bring the ideas and the concepts that we were studying more to life and more relevant for them. So I had this group of kids who 11th and 12th graders had been together. Probably most of them had been together in the same class with classmates coming and going since about 5th or 6th grade. So here they are, juniors and seniors. They've been together for a long time. They're smart, they're creative, they're really just, great kids, but they were used to doing school. And they were used to the idea that you learn something, you take a test, and then you might do a project at the end, and then you move on to the next thing. And they were used to the teacher telling them, this is exactly what it needs to look like. And they were, again, like I said, these were bright kids, but they were used to, if I make it look really good, I can get a good grade because it looks good and I don't have to put a whole lot of deep thought behind my work. So I came in trying to set up a critical skills classroom with this group and working with them to build community, to talk with them about how to collaborate, because, again, they're 11th and 12th grade. They know what group projects mean. It means that I do the whole thing so that we can get an A because I want it to look a certain way. And I know that this person, because I've been in class with them forever, isn't going to do things the way I want them to do things. So I had to really work with them to help them learn how to collaborate and help them to think about the work that we were doing. So when I put together this challenge, which I called the Mass Hysteria Challenge, I looked at, actually, if you want to go back one more for a minute. So I looked at the history and the ELA standards around research that I needed to cover. And I looked at the fact that this was a group of kids who, they were so creative. I saw that in them. I knew that was there. And they were really capable of the critical thinking. And so those were two things that I wanted to focus on and to continue to encourage them to do, rather than just, here are the exact guidelines of how I want you to do it, but to support them in being able to come up with that quality criteria of what it looks like for them to come up with the ideas that they were invested in and to learn how to work together. So I came up with the Mass Hysteria Challenge. All right, now you can go advance it, Tom. So I started it with a memo, and this is an excerpt from the memo. Is an urgent message from the commissioner to the Special Peace and Unity Squad, calling them to protect America from mass hysteria and to keep the American society peaceful and unified. So this group of kids, one of the things about them was that some of them were very much into the Marvel universe. I also had one that was very much into Star Wars. And so this whole idea of being a superhero, of coming together to save the world, was one that I took advantage of, because even though they're going to go, oh yeah, we see what you're doing, they also they got a kick out of it. So that, and they also, thought it was pretty funny when I called them the Spew Squad. So it just, just kind of tried to tap into that frame and to get them being willing to imagine. So this had 3 pieces. They had to research, they had to analyze their research, and then they had to make they had to draw a conclusion from that research, and they had to create an invention. So what they were going to have to do from their research, learning about what mass hysteria was like, how it functions, and why people fell prey to it, and how they could defend themselves or others against it. So they had to actually study mass hysteria. And then they were going to draw the conclusion and come up with a weapon and a defense system. Then they needed to design the weapon and the defense system and create a prototype that they could demonstrate. And this memo was from the commissioner and the assistant commissioner. And so they were going to have to present their inventions to the commissioner and the assistant commissioner. And when I presented the memo, they're like, "So that's just you, right?" I said, "No, actually, there is a commissioner and an assistant commissioner." So we are a small school. We are supported by a church, and the pastor of that church serves as the superintendent of our school. And so I asked the pastor, who's our school superintendent, and the principal, if they would play the role of the commissioner and the assistant commissioner, and they agreed. So the kids had a live audience come in. So Tom, if you want to go to our, so this is the results of their research. They had to pick a incident of mass hysteria. So we did a Google search. They each picked one. So again, small class. I think I had 8 kids in this particular class. So they worked on their own on this. They had to do the how did it happen, who, what, when, where, and why of journalism, and answer those questions. And you can even see in some on their posters that's how they set their poster up. And then they had to talk about it, and they had a form that they used to analyze this, and we worked together to come up with the characteristics of mass hysteria. And then they had to come up with, well, okay, so if this is how mass hysteria works, and how can we keep people from falling prey to it, and how can we fight against it? They had been learning about logical fallacies with the Crucible. That's one, when I teach the Crucible, one part that we study is logical fallacies. And so they had learned how to identify some of the common ones. And so they had been building up this foundation of understanding. And then they, based on whether they wanted to work on the defense system or the weapon, split into 2 groups. And then they went to work doing their brainstorming, coming up with their prototype, actually creating that prototype and practicing to be able to demonstrate it and to give an explanation of their understanding of mass hysteria and how their defense system and their weapon would work. So I had one of the group that decided on the, actually, I don't remember, Tom, can you go ahead and move us ahead? Yeah, so this group decided on the defense system. And so in my classroom at the time, I had 2 really big whiteboards, one that I used for main instruction. The other one was over in our lounge area. So they were able to take that whiteboard and use that for their blueprinting and their brainstorming, and use that as part of their presentation. So they came up with, for their defense, a safe room, a pair of smarty pants, and a thinking cap. And so the safe room had an aromatherapy diffuser to put in calming essential oils to calm you down. It had fun lights and a comfy chair in it. And I think it played soothing music. And then they had the smarty pants you put on to help you be smart. And the thinking cap had a little light on it that would go off. They had, I think it had a red light and a green light. And the red light was when your thoughts were, you weren't correct and you were falling for the mass hysteria. And the green light was for when you were calm and you were thinking straight. And so they brainstormed together, and then they had to, present this. They built a model out of a box of the safe room. They brought in dollhouse toys for the furniture. They had an actual pair of pants. They had a hat, baseball cap that they used circuitry on, simple circuitry on for their lights. The other group had 2 kids in it that were major tinkerers. And one of them, as soon as we started on this and I pulled out my makerspace stuff, they went right for the motors. And they're deciding on the weapon. And one of the boys that was in that group was into modifying Nerf guns. And so the two of them actually got together at one of their homes outside of school time, totally of their own volition, to modify a Nerf gun to shoot positive affirmation and some kind of special pixie dust thing that would just be sparkly and happy. So they used flour for that, and they took little pieces of paper. So instead of it shooting out Nerf bullets, it shot out these little pieces of paper that had positive things written on them. And they wired a motor to blow. They used flour for the dust that would like freeze you in your tracks if you're running at someone with a conspiracy theory, and they could shoot the positive affirmation and this dust that would get you to stop. Then they could push you into the safe room and get you to calm down. And that was the kind of the game plan for this whole thing. And so there was a lot of trial and error in trying to get the gun to work. But they did get it to actually for the demonstration. It did work. So they did a really good job with that. And they were this group. The 2 boys were all over the mod fitting this gun, and they had a girl in the group, and I was like, okay, you need to make sure she has a part in this. And so there was an opportunity to really get in there and do some coaching with that group and help them to make sure that even though the wiring and circuitry wasn't her thing, that they were deciding on their group roles in a way that every group member was able to contribute in a meaningful way and be a part of it. So they got all this ready, and the commissioner and the superintendent and the assistant commissioner came with their clipboards, and the kids did their presentations. And they had never had to do a presentation like this before. Usually, they tell what they've learned, everyone says good job, and you're done. And they were pressed to explain their thinking, explain their reasoning on different parts of the project. My friend Dan Ryder up at Mount Blue High School in Maine has this thing that he calls dumpster projects. No more dumpster projects. Everything that you do, every choice that you make in designing your project has a purpose. It has an intent for showing your understanding. And so with these projects, the questioning that they went through from the commissioner and the assistant commissioner really addressed that, where they said, why did you do this? And what is this going to do? And if you carry this out to this next step, how is that going to work? And the kids did a fabulous job of thinking on their feet and connecting their learning and showing that they really did gain an understanding of human nature, not just the literature and the history, that we were studying, but really the psychology behind it as well. And so, you know, they demonstrated, so they had to demonstrate to their class, but also to this outside audience who was not involved in the process. Because, you know, usually if your teacher is your only audience, they've been involved in the process. And so things can get left unsaid that really need to be said. And so when you have an outside audience like we did for this, you know, it really did push their thinking. So we had this, here's the group, pictures of the group that did the safe room. And then I also have some pictures of the group with the, so there's some of their playing with the motors in the pre-planning, and then their demonstration. They did the demonstration in two parts. They had to do the part with the flower outside so that they weren't making a mess inside, and the part with the shooting the little pieces of paper they did in the foyer of our building, so that it was easier to clean up. And they really did a fabulous job with this. And then at the end, after they had answered all the questions and the commissioner granted approval, said, we like your design, we're going to you know, get it into production, this is fabulous, thank you so much. The kids had to do a reflection that involved them looking at what they understood about mass hysteria before we launched into this study, and what they understood now and how that thinking had changed. And they also had to, you know, talk about their own role in the group project and how they felt that collaboration piece went. So they did an independent written reflection, but we also did a oral debriefing together with the Plus Delta, where we looked at, you know, what went well, and then, you know, if we were to do this again, or to do a similar project again, what would we do differently? So I think that's pretty much it.
Sorry, I was muted. So I was saying all kinds of things. And in the way that our current times are, all of our best ideas get said while our computers are muted. So that's fascinating. There's so much, there's this really interesting conversation now going on in the chat. And there's one piece, I guess, that I would love to hear you talk about a little bit. And that is, you know, the decision to go to an outside audience. Mm-hmm. Right. And Tom, you know, we've talked about this before in critical skills classrooms, that one of the things you're constantly trying to do is continually up the challenge, right? Because if it's too hard or too easy, then you know, the kids aren't really in that zone of proximal development. They're not learning, they're not engaged in the way that you want them to be. So introducing that outside audience really, you know, it increases the level of challenge. But, you know, Natalie, you mentioned that these kids, you know, they were successful, like they're good students. Generally, they were very good at what Rob Fried would call the game of school. How did you scaffold that external audience piece? Because we know that if you bring in an audience from the outside and the kids fall flat, then that damages your relationship, you know, it breaks trust with the community, but you also want to make sure that you're holding them to the standard, right? So there's this way that the teacher has to facilitate that pretty closely.
Mm-hmm. So I think there were two pieces that were part of making this successful for them. Was one, this was done in April or May of the year. So I had been working since September with them on the creative thinking, on all of the different critical skills piece, and trying to build up community and develop with them a sense of safety for failure, which, you know, I'll be honest, with this group, I've still, I got to June and I felt like there was so much more we could have done, because not only were they used to playing the game of school, but there were several personalities in the class that were those intense, I can't fail, I have to have it perfect personalities. And that made it even harder for them to be willing to take a risk, because they so desperately wanted to, have a 4.0 or to have things be perfect. And so, because this was later in the year and we had done a lot of smaller challenges, we had done a number of things that were just team building. And we had done a number of things that were just low stakes academic challenges, where they were getting used to some of the elements going into this. Another thing that I had in my favor was that even though the audience was outside, they were known. My principal was a teacher before she became principal. Several of the actually these kids had her as a teacher before they had her as a principal. And so even though it was like, oh, the principal is coming to do this, they also knew, we know her and she knows us. And so there was a level of safety. And same with the pastor, who's the superintendent. The school is at the church that sponsors it, and so they see him on a regular basis. They know him. He speaks in the chapels on occasion. So there is a little bit of relationship there already. If it had been a completely outside audience, strangers, that would have completely changed it. And I think this was the very first time really I had pulled in an outside audience. And I really did want to have people from within the school that the kids knew for that outside audience for that first time, because of that, what that would bring to them, because it's somebody that they know.
So
Natalie,
sorry, Tom, go ahead.
Well, I think that one of the things that you inspired me to think about was how, in addition to the authentic audience, how do getting kids who are good at school, good at the game of school, getting them invested in a scenario challenge like you have here, the authentic audience, as we've been saying, ramps up the challenge, makes it more real life, closer to a real life problem. I think one of the things that you impressed with me with in this is the role of kind of whimsy. That the whole building in the sort of superhero component really connected to their personal interests. It added a kind of it made it more accessible in a sense to them, and that seemed to have been a good component, a successful component.
Yeah, and I also wanted to be very careful not to push it too far, because I didn't want to carry it too far, and have it be so over the top that it took away from anything else. And so really it was the only place I had it was with that initial launch and then, from that point, occasionally I'd be like, your team members and whatever, but, it was just there to draw them in. And then we were able to, focus on the rest of it.
So Laura, if I could just follow up with that. Well, we seem to have lost, Laura, maybe reconnect. So I'm going to just move us to take a look. What you're making me think about here is what we're looking at right now is the experiential learning cycle in the critical skills model. And some of us are familiar with this. It's basically a way of describing what happens in problem-based challenges. And there are two cycles. There's a student cycle and a teacher cycle. And it seems to me that in this design phase of the teacher cycle, the knowledge and understanding and critical skills dispositions that you targeted you were really successful in, you really described really well how they were important to this particular group of students, and then how you tied them in as you went along through the challenge. So I'm just going to go back to remind us all what those were. And here they are. You know, you really did a great job of emphasizing the history and language arts standards. Those were clearly not lost in their presentation. They were able to express that. And yet this critical thinking and creative thinking really comes out in the way in which they were able to get engaged in the challenge.
Mhm.
Yeah, and just to build on that a little, you know, last time we did this, we had Danica Tominski with us, really focusing on that collaboration piece and the community building piece. And I think, you know, one of the nice things about your specific context is that your students already know each other really well. And so when we think back on the, you know, that stair step that we use about the development of a community, the knowledge piece that moves them up, that's already in place.
Right.
So you're able to really start a little bit farther ahead than a lot of teachers are, for better or worse, because, you know, you did say there are ways that, you know, they, as soon as you say, we're gonna work on this together, they think, I want that person, not that person. And so you have to, I guess, redefine what collaboration means. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you help them to rethink what it meant to work together, so that they didn't see this as a group project, but as a collaborative challenge.
Sure. Actually, earlier in the year, I did a lesson on collaboration. I put together a PowerPoint, and I found, you know, as many pictures and memes as I could about group work. Like there was, you know, one going around at the time that had like it was a screenshot from some movie that had like, you know, 4 or 5 people in it, and there's a label of like what each one does and doesn't do in a group work, and you know, so I put together this slideshow of that, and got them talking about collaboration, and then I had them brainstorm what is collaboration, you know, and what is the difference between, you know, how group projects usually go and what collaboration really is, and you know, what does make for successful collaboration. And we had a chart up on the wall for the whole year with their brainstorming of what makes for a successful collaboration. And so as we went into this project, some of those things they had already been practicing doing in previous activities and challenges. And some of it I was able to point back and remind them, okay, remember, you said it's going to make for successful collaboration. Let's make sure that we're doing that. And then as they were working, so I had my classroom was a double-sized room. 2 of our rooms are small, but it was a double room for us. And so I could sit in the middle, and one group would be in one half of the room, and the other group would be in the other half of the room, and I'm listening to both groups work. And I'm stepping in to direct or help them problem solve when needed, or to affirm when I hear a really good idea. And so it really did take getting them to identify, and even, you know, as identifying the elephant in the room that's there when you're doing group work that, you know, no one wants to talk about, and saying, hey, let's identify this. We know this doesn't work, so let's change it. Let's make it work.
Yeah, so then when the students had, you know, kids are evolving and growing their whole lives, right? And so sometimes they've had habits that were less collaborative, maybe earlier in their academic career. And they might have a reputation with their classmates, let's say, or they might be history. You know, Bill Vinton in the Q&A asked, you know, if they know each other really well because they've been together for so long, sometimes the history can make collaboration difficult. And you sort of talked about that, but, you know, did you have situations where you just had to sit down with kids and say, okay, I know in the past this, and now this?
Yeah.
How
Yeah,
did you do that?
it takes a willingness to sit down and talk about it with them, and have hard conversations. Sometimes I think it's easier to just, mark them down on collaboration on the rubric and let it go. But if they're going to learn how to be effective communicators, and if they're going to grow, and if they're going to learn how to collaborate effectively, hard conversations have to happen. And even if whether it's, look, you have whether it's a habit of always taking over and doing the work because you want it to look a certain way, that's got to be addressed, and you got to talk about it, and it's going to be an uncomfortable conversation. Or if it's because they tend to sit back and not do anything, and I did have some of those conversations, and they went in places that I wasn't expecting. That it got to what really was behind that. And I was able to actually, talk with some of the kids about some things that had happened, like in relationship with their classmates years ago, that they had never dealt with, that we were able to deal with, that came up because of this conversation. And it's just like, I wasn't expecting that.
Oh, well, nothing builds community like meaningful work, right?
Exactly.
I'm going to bring us back to that slide of the critical skill of the experiential learning cycle.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if I can get us over there. Because it seems to me that we've been talking a lot about, this webcast series is about what do great teachers do, right? And using stories from the classroom to kind of unpack what it is that great teachers do in order to make for meaningful learning. And it seems like, we've been talking about this sort of the design phase, how you designed in these specific standards and why you chose those. And we've just been talking about this coaching phase where, during, when they're engaged, you made specific decisions and they surprised you sometimes. And I'm wondering in this, and you also made it very clear how these standards were connected to the design phase and the coaching phase. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if you found that in the with the audience and their clipboards, or in the reflection, the debrief and the mm-hmm. reflection that the students did, was there a connecting back to these standards? Did you find that debrief reflection process also connected back to the standards you were targeting?
Yes. I think one of the things that it did was it brought the kids and my focus back to why we were doing this in the first place. Mm-hmm. So they talked about what did they know before about the topic, and how did the study change their thinking, and what do they know now, and what do they think now. And so I think, and then looking at the process of doing the group work, how did they do with the collaboration? How did, the things that we had identified as what makes effective collaboration, where did they see that in their work and in their group? And what did they do, and what did group members do that helped make it successful? And so it brought, you go through this experience and you're in the moment, right? And they came up with these creative, clever, funny, thoughtful inventions, and they did a fabulous job expressing themselves and talking about their thinking and their reasoning, and being able to even think on the fly, when, because they it wasn't like I had given them a set of questions to prepare. They didn't know what questions were going to be asked of them. And so being able to talk about that, so they're in the moment and they're nervous and they wanted to get it done and they did it, and things, worked fairly well. And then they got the approval, and you're in the moment. And then we're like, okay, let's talk about this. Okay, let's think back over the whole process and put this moment in the context of that whole process. And so it really did, being able to talk about it together and then having them sit and write a reflection that asked them to specifically think of not just about the knowledge and the understanding that they gained, but also and how they demonstrated that, but also how the whole thing had gone and how they had worked together. And it really just kind of brought it all back together.
So you just gave us a really great example of those 3 questions that are the classic debrief questions. What happened? Now what, what does it mean? And so what do we do about it now? Right? Mm-hmm. What, now what, and so what? Those sort of 3 classic debrief questions.
So I have one more question that came in the Q&A. Tom mentioned the value of whimsy in creating this activity. The question says that sometimes administrators or different teachers or whatever are all about authentic, and so they discourage the more whimsical challenges, and that's discouraging because it not only pulls the fun out, but it also discourages that authenticity. It's discouraging, I guess, that authenticity, I'm quoting there, was used as a weapon almost against these creative, fun sort of scenarios. And so I'm wondering, Tom, there's the little, there's the XY with the ray, that, right? I mean, Natalie, you can talk to this too, but where does this, when you think about this specific challenge and the arc of your school year, with this set of kiddos, where does this fall in terms of both, I guess, this image and and this debate about whether is it okay to have challenges or activities that are not 100% real world all the time, and how do you grapple with that?
I think that with this particular one, one of those, the real world piece, or the authentic piece, was that the base takeaway of the understanding of mass hysteria and critical thinking and logical fallacies and all of the pieces that were a part of that. There's your real world. They're going to, I mean, look at where we are now, with what's going on in our society. That so the frame to understand the authenticity had some whimsy and was within the walls of, within our classroom, but it was very easy for them to make application to their own life. And so, I mean, yes, when you're talking about authenticity and the very top of the scale with real world challenges and real world things, you look at, like, going out and building a tiny house working with Habitat for Humanity, or going into your community and doing something that is a part of that world. And that's usually when we say real world, that's what we're thinking about. Setting up a food pantry, or something like that. And when I was planning this and wanting to come up with a real world challenge, I really struggled with that, because I can't think of anything that I can realistically fit into my curriculum, into my situation, into my school year, that is going to be that authentic. that I can work to. But when I backed off that, restricting it to just that definition and thinking real world, they need to be able to apply it to their real world. Then that gave me the freedom to create, and to create a situation that has that whimsy, lets them have that whimsy. They need that, they want that, but also has some real serious implications. And I mean, I'm working with high school kids, and this one was with, 16, 17, 18-year-olds. And so, they'd go, whoa, that's heavy, that's deep. That's just like, this friend that I was talking with at, Dairy Queen, so they're at a point in their development where they're making those connections. I just have to lead them there. And then, they're going to go on and be able to apply those skills in other situations, I would hope. I don't know if that answers the question, but.
Oh, I think it does.
That was great. It was really wonderful to hear you think that through. And it really makes me think about how things can be authentic without necessarily being real world, 100% real world. And so it's making me kind of rethink what I mean when I think about authenticity.
Yeah, I think that's, one of the biggest struggles with kids in school is that they don't, it's the, why do we have to learn this? Wherever am I going to use this? Because things are done so much departmentalized or siloed, and they don't, and it's, us telling them, well, just trust me, you're going to use it. And so having them do authentic work, they're going to engage in that and invest in that, even if it is in a scenario that they totally recognize this is a scenario for an assignment for this book. But hey, I know that I can make connections to the outside world.
So do we have time for one more question?
I think we do.
Okay, so this will be our last question, and then we'll move into our wrap up, our closing moves, because this is a really good question. Kate asks, how do you avoid project fatigue? Or in other words, how do you determine the time it would take for such authentic learning? And Natalie, I just want to add on, I just called you Nate, I don't know why. Natalie, I would just want to sort of tag onto that too, to think back about that arc that I asked about before, and maybe how the project fatigue question maybe folds into that arc of the year design piece that I know you're always thinking about.
I'm going to get us back to this slide, just that may have some relevance.
Yeah, I think, some of it is that not everything is a project. And I also, the term, I don't know, I'm an English teacher. I love words. I teach communication. I teach rhetoric. So like, to me, words matter. But like, I didn't always call them projects. They're and I think that's one of the things about, with the critical skills model, when you talk about that, they're challenges. So it's, we're doing challenges, or we're doing learning activities. And so sometimes even just that terminology, and sometimes the kids are like, come on, it's a project. I'm like, okay, whatever, but no, I'm going to call it this. So sometimes even that terminology can make a difference to your mindset. And I think that, part of it too is another piece of that is that the thought train just derailed, and I don't know that there were survivors.
Let me help you a little bit, because I know you, having been your advisor and your teacher, I know your work so well. That I think one of the ways that, Tom, if you can go back to the XY axis thing, one of the things that you do really well in your classroom, and I've watched you do this for years, is move along that continuum over time. Mm-hmm. So at the beginning, the challenges that you have the students do are very small. And they're very well defined. And they're successful, and they're largely sort of either about building community or about learning new processes or review. And then as you move into new content, they're better at the challenges, so they require more self-direction. There are more resources. The resources are less well defined. The questions or the problems that they're solving are more complex, and they connect across disciplines more and more over time. So, and they're small. You know, Tom, do you have the connected loops on there?
It's
that. So that makes it look like they're all the same size. But having listened to you talk about your classroom, they're actually not that, it's not that regular, and they're not all the same time. Sometimes it'll be like loop, 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 loop.
And in between there is your regular, okay, we're going to read this chapter and answer these questions, and we're going to do this essay. And so there's all of those other things that you're accustomed to. I'm going to give you a lecture with PowerPoint, and you're going to do notes. So there's all these other pieces in there, in amongst these different sized challenges and projects and experiences.
So over the course of the year, fatigue can be a factor, but you're varying the different modalities that you're teaching in. And then when you get to a major problem-based challenge, then as a teacher, you're having to think, okay, is this a 2-day challenge, a week-long challenge, a 2-week challenge? And that kind of gets to, and you probably have a sense of that from all of the mini challenges and projects and lectures and everything that's come before.
And too, you have to be, we're talking about design, I have the big picture going into the year of, we're going to do this, and I want to do this challenge, and we want to, but I also am watching my kids, and when I see signs of that fatigue, and I was planning to do, maybe I was planning to do a project, or I was planning to do a certain type of project, and I was like, you know what, that's not going to be good for them right now. I need to change that and do it this way, or take out this element, or add in this element. And so there's that certain, responding to the group and where they are at in what's going on, instead of just, because I'm teaching the kids, I'm not teaching the curriculum, and so I've got to make adjustments based on what their needs are at the time.
Right.
That's great. That's great. So there are a couple of other questions, but since we're about out of time, I'm going to email those to you, Natalie, and maybe you can write out answers, and we'll put them in the resources document.
Yep.
And that way, the couple of other questions that we didn't get to, people will be able to get those answers there. So any final thoughts before we go into the very last things? I know.
You said a lot already, Natalie. Thank you so much. It's really, thank you for a really thought-provoking and great example.
Yeah. So on this next slide here that you're looking at, there is some information about how to follow us on Twitter or on Instagram. The resources document for this webinar can be found at this tiny URL, which is on the screen. You'll also receive this by email, so don't worry if you don't have time to get it written down. Our YouTube channel is youtube.com/criticalskills1, which is where all of the information comes out about these webinars.
The recordings.
What?
And the recordings.
And the recordings, yes. Next time, is that where we are? Yes. We will have Bill Vinton with us. And here's a little bit about Bill. Bill has actually been one of the participants in the chat today as well. He's been really helpful. And Bill is one of our most experienced master teachers. He has been working with Critical Skills Classroom. Gosh, Tom, do you know how long?
He was a teacher of mine.
So he has a long history with critical skills, and he is going to be talking about critical skills as the essential learning ingredient in teaching and learning. So you'll be getting a link for that as well. And if, again, here's the URL, which will also be emailed to you, to do the evaluation and to download a certificate of participation for this event. So we thank you so much for being with us. We thank Natalie, who has been fabulous and brave in jumping in as one of our first guests. And so we will look forward to seeing everybody in 2 weeks. Same bat time, same bat station. And I will also drop this link into the chat so that folks can see it. Assuming that I can figure out how to get to it. Here we go. Okay, so there is the link to the resources, and the evaluation is also linked there as well. If you have any questions or problems, feel free to give us a holler and we will be happy to help. Otherwise, we'll see you in 2 weeks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Natalie.
Bye.
You're welcome. Thank you.